Imagine you are a queen in the Middle Ages. The court bows when you pass, servants scatter to obey your slightest command, and jewels sparkle across your gown. To outsiders, your life seems like a dream. But behind the high walls of the palace, your marriage is not built on trust. It is built on suspicion. Every word you speak, every glance you give, every absence from your chamber may be twisted into evidence of betrayal. For a queen, loyalty was not assumed. It had to be proven. And kings, haunted by paranoia and the constant threat of rivals, devised tests of loyalty so dark, so humiliating, that they could ruin a woman forever. This was not about love. It was about control, lineage, and power. A single rumor of infidelity could topple dynasties, spark wars, or delegitimize heirs to the throne. And so, some kings believed they had the right to test their wives in ways that would today feel cruel, invasive, and deeply unjust. As we step into these shadowed corridors of history, you will hear stories of queens forced into degrading trials, accused without evidence, and watched in secret by their own husbands. The question of loyalty was less about the truth and more about a king's fear. What you are about to discover is not just how women were treated, but how fragile royal power truly was. But before we begin, I want you to pause for a moment. Where are you watching this from? Leave a comment telling me your country, because these stories of power, suspicion, and broken trust belong to all of history. And while you're here, make sure you subscribe, because every week we uncover the hidden truths that others leave buried in silence. Now, let us go back into chambers where queens lived in fear of betrayal, not just from courtiers, but from their own husbands. Kings, desperate to prove their wives' faithfulness, devised trials that revealed more about their own insecurities than about any actual disloyalty. Some queens survived, others lost everything. And as you listen, ask yourself, was loyalty ever truly possible in a world where suspicion never slept? Royal palaces were not just homes, they were prisons of glass. A queen's life was constantly observed, and kings used this surveillance as the first test of loyalty. Servants were ordered to spy, reporting every detail of her behavior. If she lingered too long in a hallway, if she exchanged a glance with a knight, even if she prayed for too many hours, it could all be twisted into suspicion. In England, King Henry VIII is remembered for his cruelty toward his wives. But he was not alone. Across Europe, monarchs placed spies within their queens' households. Ladies-in-waiting, meant to be companions, were often the king's informants. A queen could never be certain if the friend beside her was actually her betrayer. Some kings went further. Chronicles describe rulers disguising themselves to test their wives. They would dress as commoners and slip into their queen's chambers, pretending to be intruders, hoping to catch signs of infidelity. These staged encounters often said more about the king's paranoia than the queen's loyalty. But the darkest form of watching was the use of forced bedchamber witnesses. On nights when heirs were conceived, trusted courtiers or physicians were stationed nearby, listening, ensuring that the queen's intimacy occurred only with the king. The very act of producing children became a monitored performance, stripped of dignity. To be watched constantly was its own punishment. Imagine living each day knowing that a careless smile, an innocent word, or a moment of sadness might be reported. Queens walked a tightrope of performance, forced to act loyal not just in truth, but in appearance. And in a court fueled by gossip, appearances often mattered more than reality. This surveillance was the first stage of loyalty testing. It broke queens not with violence, but with the slow poison of paranoia. And yet, for some kings, simply watching was not enough. They wanted proof, tangible, brutal, undeniable. And so they devised trials that stripped their wives of privacy, dignity, and even their very humanity. Before marriage, many queens were subjected to virginity examinations, a practice meant to guarantee their purity. But in some courts, even after marriage, these trials were revived to test loyalty. If a king doubted his wife's faithfulness, midwives and physicians were summoned to perform humiliating inspections. One notorious example comes from the court of France. When whispers spread that Queen Isabeau of Bavaria might be unfaithful, factions at court demanded proof. Though the records veil details, chronicles hint at examinations designed not for truth, but for political theater. Virginity and loyalty were intertwined in the medieval mind. A woman's body was considered a vessel of lineage, and any hint that it had been corrupted threatened dynasties. These so-called tests, of course, were neither accurate nor fair. They were spectacles of control, forcing queens into degradation to reassure the fragile pride of kings. In some cases, queens were forced to endure public rumors more damaging than the trials themselves. A king's accusation, even without evidence, could stain a queen's reputation permanently. And once suspicion was cast, no medical examination could fully restore her honor. What made these trials so horrific was not just the act itself, but the betrayal it revealed. To be examined like a criminal by order of your own husband was a wound that no crown could cover. It showed that trust, the foundation of marriage, had already shattered. And yet the cruelty did not end with examinations. Some kings devised even darker tests, trials designed not only to expose, but to punish. When suspicion grew too great, queens faced public trials. Unlike ordinary women, they were rarely subjected to fire or water ordeals, but their tests were no less brutal. The court itself became the arena. In Spain, chronicles tell of queens accused of treasonous love affairs being paraded before nobles, forced to defend themselves while witnesses, often enemies, spoke against them. These were not trials of justice, but performances of humiliation. The outcome was rarely in doubt. A queen accused was a queen condemned. Anne Boleyn's fall is perhaps the most famous. Accused of adultery with multiple men, she faced a trial staged to justify her execution. Witnesses were coerced, evidence fabricated. For Henry VIII, it was not truth that mattered, but the appearance of betrayal. By destroying Anne publicly, he affirmed his own power. In other courts, the punishment was exile. Queens found guilty of disloyalty were sent to convents, stripped of wealth and status, condemned to live out their days in silence. The irony was cruel. Many of these women were not guilty, but the accusation alone was enough. The ordeal of accusation served a political purpose. It reminded every courtier that queens were not untouchable. Even the highest-born woman could be cast down if she lost the king's trust. But for the queens themselves, the ordeal was devastating. To stand before your own husband, accused, judged, and condemned, was a betrayal deeper than any crime. And it revealed a grim truth. These loyalty tests were never about proof. They were about power. What then was the price of loyalty for a queen? For some, it was submission. The endless performance of obedience, the constant fear of suspicion, the acceptance of humiliation. For others, it was their very life. Execution, exile, or lifelong imprisonment awaited those who failed their king's tests, whether guilty or not. But the deepest price was invisible. It was the erosion of trust. A marriage built on suspicion is no marriage at all. These queens lived in gilded cages, knowing that their worth was measured not by their hearts, but by their bodies, their fertility, and their perceived loyalty. History remembers kings as powerful, but these stories reveal their weakness. A truly strong ruler would not need to test his wife in such cruel ways. These trials of loyalty were confessions of fear, fear of betrayal, fear of illegitimate heirs, fear of losing control. And yet, the queens endured. Some played the role so perfectly that suspicion never touched them. Others resisted and paid with everything. Their stories remind us that behind the glitter of crowns were human beings, living under a weight of suspicion few could survive. So the next time you think of queens in history, do not just picture jewels and feasts. Remember the eyes watching them, the whispers circling them, the trials that haunted them. Their loyalty was never trusted. It was tested in the darkest ways imaginable. And now I'll leave you with a question. If you were in their place, constantly watched, accused, and tested, could you have survived?